What I had learned about special relativity and general relativity was a false hypothesis and interpreted incorrectly by the mainstream of physics thinking.
We have heliocentrism, which is the idea that the sun is at the center of the universe, the earth is revolving around the sun. Then we have the geocentric model, which puts the earth at the center, but there's an even secondary take within that on geostatism. Could you describe what that is and how it differs from the traditional concept that is typically tied with geocentrism?
The Bible says the world is geocentric. The majority of scientists today are totally in conflict with that, not for scientific reasons, but because their moral principles don't allow them to accept what has been stated in the Bible. In this clever experiment, Airy has shown two things. Number one, that the earth doesn't move. Number two, that there is an ether that is affecting the starlight as it comes to earth. Geocentrism is proven, and the existence of ether is proven. What did mainstream do with this? They ridiculed it and called it Airy's failure. It was not. It was Airy's success. He successfully proved geocentrism and the existence of ether.
Robert, thank you so much for joining me. I am thrilled to be having this conversation. I want to give a huge shout out to Mark Gober, first for introducing us, and then second for helping me formulate some good questions for this podcast episode. For those who are not familiar with Mark Gober, I question how much you've listened to my show, and that's okay. I've had him on a number of times, both to talk about medicine and virology, but also to talk about his latest book, and Into the Upside Down Cosmos, which is a fantastic book that we'll link in the show notes. But I'm thrilled to be having this conversation because other than Dr. Steve Young, who I've also interviewed, I don't know of any other credentialed expert, so to speak, who is questioning relativity in the heliocentric model to the degree that you are. So you're the second person I've come across aside from Dr. Steve Young. Have you had any contact with him, by the way?
Only through email.
Okay. Be interesting one day to have you both on a podcast episode together to discuss all this. And it may be challenging, though, to break it down to laymen and women if I get both of you on the same stream, given your training.
Bring it down to earth.
Yeah, get down to earth, so to speak. Exactly. So could we just start by you giving a background into your education, your credentials, and then also your thesis, because that obviously relates to the discussion that we'll be having today.
Sure, Alan. I appreciate the opportunity that you've given me to promote my thoughts across the internet unisphere. I guess I could start with high school, where I got the interest in physics when I took it in senior year. I found that it was easy, it was interesting, and also I noticed that the rest of the class didn't seem to grasp things as quickly as I did. So I decided to go on to college, and I majored in electronic physics, and we had a co-op schedule, which means that we worked at local Philco plants. Philco doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be a company that manufactured radios. So I had a work ethic imposed by working half the time and going to night school, and then going to a full day schedule, alternating 6 months for the last 2 years. So what I majored in was electronic physics, but I also had 24 credits of philosophy, and I could claim that as a minor. And it's something I regret not having paid attention to, basically sleeping through classes. And now I think that philosophy is one of the most important subjects. Now that I'm up in my years and looking back, philosophy would have been something which would have greatly benefited me. So I had philosophy, and this is all, by the way, with Jesuit training, both in high school and in college. I had 8 years of Jesuit training. Some people would say indoctrination. This is before the Vatican Council. So this is before the Jesuits took a liberal left turn. So this is, if you want, pre-Vatican II. So a lot of the complaints that people have about the Jesuits today weren't apparent when I was going to school. It was a strictly disciplined education. Okay, after college, I went on to Stevens Tech to get my doctorate in physics. My thesis was on rigid body motion, which applied general relativity, Einstein's general relativity, to rotational objects in, let's say, in the neighborhood of the Earth. That is, satellites. And it turns out that at the same time, there was an experiment out in California run by William Fairbanks, which tested general relativity in space by testing the predictions. So my thesis was on general relativity. So I was definitely in the mainstream as far as the world is concerned. And it's kind of ironic that I've become a dissident as far as relativity is concerned. As I learned more and more after I left school, I've learned more and more reasons for questioning the very foundations that the mainstream physics group believes in today. So I graduated from Stevens in about 1970 with a doctorate in physics. I went to teach at Manhattan College. Where is Manhattan College? It's in the Bronx, of course, because it originally was in Manhattan and moved later to the Bronx. I also taught at a community college for a few years, 15 years. But then the world became aware of personal computers. So this was in the 90s. And I bought a computer and I started fooling around with it with languages that you've probably never heard of, BASIC and Fortran, PL1. All of these have basically disappeared as more programs evolve. Yeah, so I'm at the stage of starting to question the things that I've been taught. I was teaching at a community college for 15 years, as I said, teaching math and physics. And I gave a talk once on Einstein's relativity on the book that was written by Martin Gardner. And it was, of course, pro-mainstream. It followed the book exactly. And again, it's ironic that it's exactly what I would refute in terms of what I know today. All right. So I had the computer, and after about 15 years, I decided to go out into the world, get a real job, as they said, and worked for a small phone company in competition with Bell Labs, American phone meter. Then I worked, this should be interesting. I worked at Bell Labs as a consultant for about 4 years at their Hondo location. And I learned Unix because that was their corporate choice for language, for operating system rather. And I taught system analysis. In this job, I taught the business units in AT&T how to effectively analyze the problem using system analysis and then divide that up into parts that can be reused in future development. In other words, look to expanding the system while you're building it. So you don't have problems where the architecture is frozen and you can't expand it. Now, previously to this, I had worked in a company called Phone Meter, right? And that they had also done work with charging for the phone, how to know what your rates were, basically. After Bell Labs, I went to JP Morgan Chase, and I was hired there to introduce what I had learned at Bell Labs into Chase. Now, you may say, why would what I knew in the phone company be relevant to Chase, which is a banking system? The answer is we had a system that we worked on called Milnet. MILNET was used by the military as a very effective way of communicating because it was almost impossible to intercept the messages, or as long as there was a connection somewhere between the points, the connection could be made. I used that knowledge of MILNET to introduce what now we know as the Internet to J.P. Morgan Chase. It was known as Chemical Chase at that time. So my role was show the business units how to use the Internet in their banking roles. And so in a way, I was in effect the first person at Chase to show the business units how to use the Internet. Now, after that, this is the last year before retirement, I went to teach basically a charitable job. I taught a 7th grade at a Catholic parochial school, and then I retired at 65. And I've been doing research for the last 20 years on what really interests me, which is the topics you mentioned at the beginning, the roles in physics that everyone admires, basically, respects, and yet in many cases they're going by the authority of the mainstream scientists. And I hope today that we can expose some of the weaknesses in that thinking in our dialogue today.
I hope so as well. And I think we'll do very well at that, or you'll do very well at that. I'm just asking questions. So what led you to question relativity in the first place?
Well, there was a conflict in what relativity claimed through experimentation, which was principally the Michelson Morley experiment. I'll refer to that as the MMX, which was done in 1887 and was a test for the Aether to see if you could show that the Earth was plowing through the Aether as it orbited the Earth, as it orbited the sun. Now, that's a refutation, if it did occur, that you could show that the Earth was at rest, would show that relativity is not really the effective tool that people say. The special relativity basically claims that the speed of light, it's always constant, c, and that there are effects that we can detect experimentally that confirm this. Now, first, I challenge that the speed of light is constant because there have been experiments like the Sagnac effect and the Fresnel experiment, which show that the speed of light depends on the medium, also on a speed which is not directly observable, but is detected by our instruments and which we can identify as the ether speed. So what I had learned about special relativity and general relativity in my training was basically a false hypothesis and interpreted incorrectly by the mainstream of physics thinking. So relativity has become, for me, the first obstacle in my understanding or my acceptance of mainstream thinking.
Can you go into a little bit more detail on what exactly the Michelson Morley experiment, the MMX, showed and how it was misinterpreted and used to reify relativity? And for those listening and watching, just to give some background context, and please fill in the gaps as necessary, Robert, relativity is a fundamental component to our current mainstream cosmological model involving how the Earth and the celestial bodies behave with each other. Would you say that's a sufficient way to briefly describe relativity?
Yeah, I say that's a good one-sentence summary. I think we have a graphic for Michelson Morley, if I remember correctly. This is a model of the experiment, which should be familiar to everyone. If you have a boat crossing a river and compare it to a boat traveling the same distance up and downstream. So that's shown by number 1 and number 2, respectively. You can time how long does it take the boat to go across the river from A to B and back, or you can time it from example 2, going from A to C and back. Now, some people would say, well, that's the same distance, so it should be the same time. But it isn't, because the speed of the river affects the speed of the boat. The speed of the boat is constant through the water, but the water itself is moving. Now, it turns out that it takes more time to come back upstream against the river than the time that you save going down. So it would actually take you longer to go from A to C and back than to go across from A to B and back. And what has this got to do with the Michelson Morley? Well, if we think of the boat as a photon, as a unit of light energy, and we send the photon back and forth across a stream of ether, assuming that there is a wind of ether. In the upper right, you see the letter V, which represents the speed of the river, but it could also represent the speed of the ether when it's applied to the MMX. Okay, so we have this experiment which is going to test whether it is true that the Earth orbits the sun by pointing the instrument in different directions to find out if indeed there is a difference in their time. And the way we do this with light is using an interferometer, which measures the difference in the number of waves that return when we know the number of waves that we sent out. In other words, when we see a frequency change. And this frequency change, called a fringe shift, can be visually seen on a screen, projected. And so this is a very clever way of making what is basically invisible, the flow of ether, and making it visible to experimenters by amplifying the size of the difference in the waves. So basically what we're doing with this experiment is trying to find out, is there an ether wind that goes through the Earth due to the Earth orbiting the sun? Now, the experiments at first were quite shocking to the mainstream because it seemed to show that the experiment was ether didn't seem to exist because the fringe shift, although very small, was considered to be zero or null. So they said there is no ether and that the Earth seems to be at rest. But there couldn't be any explanation of this in terms of the heliocentric model, which we have to go back to the 15th century to discuss. At the time of Galileo and Copernicus, the Earth was thought to be the center of the universe. It was a geocentric universe, and that the sun was orbiting the Earth, just as it appears to be when we look at the sky. But they said that the sun really was the center of the universe, and that if you were on the sun, you would see the Earth orbiting. So the MMX was a way of testing this to see if we could detect the Earth's motion around the sun. As I said, there was a very small fringe shift, but it wasn't zero. But they claimed that it was zero and said that proves that there is no ether. But then we had the problem, well, then how can you explain why the Earth isn't standing still? They said that's because lengths contract and time changes, which is part of the special relativity theory. And if you apply these ideas, you can say that the reason that the light fringe shift didn't change is because the distance that the light traveled contracted in length, and that the time that it took to travel took longer. In other words, they said, no matter how you measured the speed of light, it would always be distance over time would always give you the value of c, which is 3 times 10 to the 10 centimeters per second. Of course, there were many reasons to object to this. It isn't logical to say that when like a ruler is in motion, that it shrinks in size. nor is it reasonable to say that a clock runs slower when it's in motion, because the first thing you have to answer is motion with respect to what? And this is what the experiment showed. So at the turn of the century, the 19th century, in 1905, Einstein had promoted his special relativity theory, which was designed to answer the MMX dilemma. It said that, yes, the Earth is orbiting the sun. We have a heliocentric system. And the reason this can happen is basically because lengths can change their size and clocks can run at different rates. And this is what has caused total confusion in over 120 years since that theory was promoted. And so I have reasons for disagreeing with the relativity experiment. And among those are the Newton's bucket and other experiments which were done by Sagnac in 1913 and by Ruyan Yang in 2005.
Real quick, Robert, before we get to that, just so I can clarify. So the results, when looked at objectively, indicated a small fringe shift, which would indicate the presence of ether, but they put the results to 0. And then they, in order to explain the results, they had the presupposition that, well, we already know that the Earth is not stationary. We already know that it's a ball revolving around the sun. And because we already know that, in order to explain these results, it must mean that time dilates and that the light bends. And that's how they reified their presupposition when all the results really pointed to the presence of ether and the Earth being stationary. Is that correct?
Everything you said is correct, except light bending is general relativity, not special relativity. Everything you said is correct. Good summary.
Okay, so this is a pretty big deal then. So what we're talking about is this is a foundational experiment that was done where they had this presupposition about the nature of the Earth in relation to the sun. And the results indicated, when looked at objectively, the opposite of that. So they brought in, as a rescue device, relativity to explain the results, when, again, objectively, the results indicated otherwise. And from my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong on this Michelson Morley style experiment has been repeated a number of times, and each time the experimenters got the same result.
Yes, I can explain why they get the same results. What they assumed was that if you had a vacuum, that would prevent any impurities in the flight of the light back and forth. Okay? In other words, if you could pump all of the air out of the system so that the light beam was moving basically in the same conditions as outer space, that this would free the experiment from any problems. This is what the experimenters had tried to explain, was the results of the experiment compared with the theory. Now, the experiment had some problems with it. The medium that was being used originally was air. So they said, let's pump the air out and purify it so that it's just a vacuum. But experiments since then, done by all over the world, by even in Russia, they have provided us with the knowledge that when you remove the air from the light path, it makes it impossible for ether to have an effect on the light beam, okay? The analogy that I use is a bathtub. Suppose you wanted to measure the waves in your bathtub, okay, for whatever reason. So you say, okay, I'm going to measure the waves, but the water may have impurities. So I'm going to pump the water out. I'm going to drain the water out of the bathtub, and then I'm going to measure the water waves. Well, what's wrong with that logic?
You're removing the medium that it has the waves in it.
Right. You're throwing the baby out with the bathwater is the expression. In effect, that's what they're doing. The air is necessary for the ether to interact with it and to produce the fringe shift. So as they pump down to better and better vacuums, They're declaring, we're proving more and more that light speed is always constant. Of course it is. You're removing the way to detect it. So that's the explanation for all of these claims that light speed is always constant. It isn't. If you measure it with the Sagnac experiment and with others, you'll find out that it isn't constant. It depends on the ether, and it depends on the medium, the air or the water or whatever is in the path.
So for you, when you were learning all this about the MMX, I'd imagine that this presented some glaring foundational issues with what you had been taught about, obviously, relativity, but also the nature of the Earth, because the results would indicate that the Earth is stationary, and this has been repeated a number of times. So I'd imagine you went through a lot of cognitive dissonance with that.
Yes. But I saw the reason why. The reasoning was faulty. And that's because assuming that the vacuum is the ideal path for light. It isn't. Not if you want to detect the presence of ether. So since then, I've learned that there are other experiments besides Michelson Morley. Michelson-Gale, which measured the rotation of the Earth, and actually was measuring the rotation of the ether around the Earth, and then the Sagnac and the other experiments.
Can you explain those just a little bit? If I think it might be interesting to explain those. You mentioned the Sagnac a number of times.
Yeah, that's also on the graphics right below. Yeah, right below where you had it. Now, in 1913, which is 8 years after the Einstein's relativity paper, Sagnac decided to prove that relativity was false. That is, that the speed of light is not constant. And he took a rotor rotating a disk, and he sent light beams around the disk, starting at one point and going around the circumference in opposite directions, one clockwise, the other counterclockwise. And you see that in the left diagram. If the disk is stationary, okay, as the diagram shows on the left, then they travel the same distance around the circumference and they meet at the opposite diameter. Okay? No problem. Now, if I set this in rotation, what does Einstein say? Well, the speed of light will be constant. So the same thing should happen. If I rotate, the beam should meet at the opposite diameter, like diagram 1 on the left. What Sagnac showed was, again, the same situation, sending two half beams in opposite directions. The clockwise beam corresponds to the rotation of the rotor, and it advances past the opposite diameter. And by a distance delta L, shown in the diagram, it encounters the counterclockwise, which has been delayed or retarded by the rotation of the rotor. Now, the light and the rotor are not in contact. The light is traveling above the rotor. So through the space between the light beam and the rotor, there must be some physical substance that is rotating with the rotor and causing the delay of the right-hand light beam and the increase in speed of the left hand. It's a very dramatic experiment. It is involved in inertial navigation systems. It is used on boats, on planes, on satellites in order to provide a measure of rotation, how fast an object is rotating. So the mainstream cannot deny, Alec, that this exists. This is a well-known phenomenon, the Sagnac. In fact, it's in GPS, okay, which you must use the Sagnac effect in order to correctly predict the satellite time, the timing of the satellite signals. If you don't use the Sagnac effect, you can't do it. All right, so this is one experiment that shows that the light speed is increased by a speed v when the light travels with the ether, the rotating ether, and it is delayed by the same speed v, where v is the speed of the ether, which is the speed of the rotor. In other words, the rotor is dragging the ether along with it all around in the space all around it, just like if you had a wheel spinning in water or in air or in smoke, you would see the smoke or the water being dragged along with the rotor. The difference is you can't see the ether, but you can prove that it's there with the light test. This, as I said, is an indisputable test. Even special relativists have to admit. And by the way, Sagnac in his experiment, in his paper, mentions ether as a whirlpool that explains this 11 times. 11 times. And there's other, of course, this has been repeated. The linear version of this was done by Ruyen Wang. He used I call it an air glider, a glider that goes up and down on a cushion of air, so there's no friction. And he timed the speed of the glider with the ether and against the ether, and he found the same result, either adds or subtracts from the speed of light, depending which way you're going.
Is the ether a constant?
Well, the ether is, if the rotor is constant, then the speed of the ether is constant. In other words, it matches the speed of the rotor. What you have to distinguish is there's two kinds of ether. There's the ether that's dragged by the motion of matter, which is what we just discussed. And then we have to ask, well, what if in the universe there is something that can produce an ether wind? Okay, call that a natural ether then, right? So the results will be the same if I try to measure it with the speed of light, but the source could be different. Rotating mass will definitely cause ether, an ether wind. And as I could discuss later, is we've detected ether in the cosmic microwave background, and we've detected in other astronomical measurements. So there seems to be beams of ether that are coming at us from different directions in space. And we can get into the theology behind this, if you want, later on.
Hey, y'all, I'm here with Melissa Kupsch from Remedy Academy of Homeopathy. We are so stoked here at The Way Forward to be partnering with Melissa and Remedy in order to spread the message of homeopathy across the world, and also to partner on the eventual development of healing centers across the United States.
People are pretty quickly coming to realize that frequency is the future of medicine. We are witnessing the great resurgence of homeopathy right now. We're really moving away from that suppressive medical model, whether it's for eczema, asthma, hormones, fertility, anxiety, depression, trauma, whatever it is, it all starts as energy in the person's field first. If we change our field, we can completely change our life. Our 2-year academy is open worldwide to anyone who wants to become a homeopath. We've got 5 lecturers and we currently have over 500 students enrolled, which is record numbers in our field. A career in homeopathy is amazing for anyone who wants flexibility in their work and who wants to be valuable in creating this new world. We have stay-at-home parents enrolled. We have ex-medical professionals, grandparents signed up who want to learn how to heal their grandchildren and pass on that invaluable knowledge. We even have husband and wife teams. So my husband enrolled in the course with no prior knowledge of health as a background, and he is loving it.
Kylie is also enrolled as well. So my partner is, and she's so stoked to become a homeopath and to be helping to spread this message across the world.
The thing that we hear from so many of our students is, I found my thing. Homeopathy is the key. We harness frequencies from nature and we alter the field of all creations. So if anybody wants to join us or they want to know more about it, they can visit our website.
Yeah, and all that information will be in the show notes. So if you want to learn more about Remedy Academy, also Remedy Collective, also some of the homeopathic products that they have, please just head to the show notes. All of that will be listed there. I want to get into the theology behind it later on and also discuss just a lot more about ether itself later on, because I've become almost obsessively curious with ether over the last 2.5 to 3 years, especially with respect to, you could say, metaphysical or spiritual phenomena, because I think it just makes a lot more sense of these various phenomena that mainstream physics and really the mainstream scientific community likes to conjure up hypothetical particles that have not been demonstrated to exist to try to explain various phenomena. But we can set that aside for later. You mentioned Newton's bucket. Could you describe that a little bit as well?
Yeah, that's one of the key ideas that I've worked on. Just to review historically, when Newton published his Principia in 1687, right? 330 something years ago. He, of course, promoted Newton's laws, which we all know. Newton's third law is the basis of mechanics, even today. Okay. And he also included an experiment that he did, which contradicted his laws. He considered a water bucket that was spinning in his laboratory up to the point where the water was spinning at the same speed as the bucket. Okay. He said, let me apply my laws, especially the laws of rotation, the centripetal law, which says that the force exerted on a rotating object is towards the center, centripetal, and it's proportional to the mass, to the speed of the rotating object, and the radius, how far it is from the axis of rotation. Okay, that's it. That's the three things that you need to predict what the centripetal force is. Okay, so he said, let me measure from the laboratory what the centripetal force prediction would be. So he's not measuring, he's predicting with a law of physics. This is very important because this is what mainstream often blurs together. Kinematics is the physics study of measurement. So if you go into physics, there's two main groups you can join. You can be an experimentalist, okay, do testing, or you could be a theorist. Of course, you could be both, but in general, that's what you break down into. Experimentalist is kinematics. Dynamics is prediction of future events before they happen, of course. So that's what laws of physics means, dynamics, not kinematics. Okay, so he applied centripetal force and he said, okay, I see the water is rotating with a speed v. I see that it's a certain distance r, and it's forming a vortex. In other words, the water is creeping up the sides and it forms like a U shape along the side. Everyone is familiar with this. You can do this with a glass of water and make it spin. Okay, so he said, does my law predict this? Yes, it does. If I know the mass of the water, the speed, and so on, and the rim, the radius. So he said, okay, with the bucket, then I can predict correctly what the centripetal force is. Now, if you're on the bucket, let's call it a bucket observer. Okay, someone attached to the bucket who is moving with the bucket. So to make sure you understand this means that if Newton sees the bucket rotating clockwise, then if you're on the bucket, you see Newton rotating counterclockwise. In other words, you see the lab spinning in the opposite direction to what Newton sees. That's what I mean by a bucket observer. Someone at rest in the bucket. Okay, he sees that the water is not moving. So V equals 0. So he applies Newton's law and says, okay, so the force, the centripetal force should be 0. But what he sees is a contradiction to this. The water is not rotating as he sees it, but it is curved. It is a vortex. It's not flat. It's not still. So this is a contradiction to the laws of physics, but it did work in the Earth frame. It doesn't work when you're rotating. So since then, physicists have called this inertial frame. Okay. Whatever the laws of physics obey, when you're in that frame, it's an inertial frame. Otherwise, it's a non-inertial frame, like the bucket observer. Now, what hasn't been shown? Well, let me give you the history. Newton said that the explanation for this was an absolute frame, that there is absolute space and absolute time also, so that when the bucket rotates with respect to absolute space, you get the centripetal force. Okay? But then people said, okay, where should I put my observer that corresponds to this absolute space? And he says, no, this is just an abstraction. This is just mathematical space. Okay? So he couldn't tell us where to put the observer so that he would observe the same thing that Newton did. The other explanation was by Ernst Mach, called the Mach's universe. And he said basically that inertia is causing the difference, and the inertia is being caused by the distant stars, the rest of the universe. So somehow the attraction of all of the masses in the universe produces this difference between what you measure on Earth and what you measure in the rotating bucket. But my response to that is, well, suppose I take the bucket from Newton's lab and I put it outside in the yard. Will it still do it? Yes. Suppose it's 100 feet in the air and I perform the experiment. Will it still do it? Yes. Suppose it's in outer space. Well, we could do that with the astronauts. We could test that and see if they predict correctly, since they're in a rotating spacecraft, if they predict correctly or not. And the answer is, you could put the bucket anywhere in the universe, and it would somehow be able to know that if it's spinning with respect to the Earth, then it's valid, then it's invalid laws. But if it's stationary with respect to the Earth, then the laws are correct. So if I extend the experiment by mental extension to consider the whole universe, then the answer is the Earth is the only inertial frame. It's the only frame in which the laws of physics are valid. I don't know why the so-called great minds in physics have not been able to discern this. I think, Alex, one of the biggest obstacles is theology, because if you go back to the Michelson Morley experiment, the indication that the Earth was at rest, right, which is the null result, saying that, no, we didn't get any result for rotation, for the motion of the Earth through the ether. This goes back to the 15th century with the clash, the Copernican principle that the Earth is just an orbit, a satellite of the sun, and not really the center. Now, this is in conflict with the Bible, which everywhere says that either that the Earth is stationary, says it flat out, the Earth is at rest, it cannot be moved. All right, that's a direct quote. Then there's other similar quotes. There are a few quotes that say the sun and the moon were at rest. And this happened during Joshua's battle, when when the sun and the moon stood still so that he could win the Israelites could win the battle. Okay. But that's an exception. That's saying that normally the Earth is stationary and the sun and the moon are in motion. And then there's another one called Hezekiah's shadow on the stones on the steps of the temple. But that's unclear. Did just the shadow move, or did the sun move, which caused the shadow? In any case, you can't avoid it. The Bible says the world is geocentric. The Earth is the center of the universe. And scientists, the majority of scientists today, are totally in conflict with that. Not for scientific reasons, not because scientific method has disproven it, but because their theological, their moral principles don't allow them to accept what has been stated in the Bible. So I think a lot of the problems today you can trace back to this conflict between religion and science.
Yeah. I have a question. The Copernican principle, from my understanding, is sort of indicating that we are not special, meaning like we on the Earth are not special relative to the universe, right? That we're just one of the many bodies floating out in space, revolving around various star systems, et cetera, et cetera. And that idea is a philosophical, theological assumption that has not been empirically demonstrated with any rigorous scientific experiment, correct? Like that is the foundational assumption that mainstream cosmologists and proponents of the heliocentric model are framing their entire worldview around. And then when, for example, in the MMX experiment, it indicates the opposite of that, they have to come up with additional rescue devices to reify their preconceived idea that we are not special, that we're just one of many rocks, quote unquote, floating in space.
Yes, they know what their destination is, and they have to figure out how to get there. and the destination does not include God. So, I mean, that is my general observation of all the research in all of my years, is that the core problem is not that mainstream doesn't understand the issues. I mean, they are brilliant. They're gifted intellectually, but they are weak in logical principles, and they resist the truth, even when it is demonstrated using the scientific method. I mean, the Sagnac method that I showed you and other experiments can't be denied, and yet they are not interpreted correctly. Even the MMX, their calculation of what the fringe shift should be, is incorrect. Okay, so it should be small, but it isn't zero. That's what they claim allows them to say that the speed of light is always constant, because they never see any ether change. Well, I'm working right now on a theory that will explain how big the fringe shift should be. And it's actually in the hundreds of kilometers per second, which is much faster than the Earth is supposed to be going around the sun. Actually, the sun is going around the Earth. That's 30 kilometers per second in the geocentric model.
Real quick, well, yeah, I have another question regarding the Copernican principle. So could you just share some of the, other than what we've already discussed, some other observational anomalies, so to speak, like the axis of evil in the cosmic microwave background, and also, like, why do cosmologists literally label that evil?
Yeah, it's good that you picked that up. I didn't mention that I co-authored a book with Robert Sungenis called Galileo Was Wrong. I'm not really a co-author. He is the main author, did all the work. I contributed a chapter. So I am a contributing author. Anyway, that book explains a lot of the questions that you've asked and others regarding the true meaning of the universe, the true theory of the universe. That's the cosmic microwave background. Okay. That was discovered accidentally a mile away from where I was working at Homedale, I said, in New Jersey. Not when I was there, but before. A few miles down the road, 2 Bell Labs scientists were doing microwave investigations of the sky, and they found out that there was a constant hum in their receiver. To make a long story short, it turned out that it's the cosmic microwave background. Now, what we see in the sky at night is, of course, are the stars giving visible light. But what we cannot see, because our eyes are not sensitive to it, are the microwaves, or all other infrared, ultraviolet. Everything else is invisible. But with this instrument, they can detect this low level, low temperature, 2.7 degrees Kelvin. That's absolute temperature, not centigrade, which is 273 degrees below zero on the centigrade scale. So it is very cold in space. Yes. And it is basically uniform, except that there are slight fluctuations, slight pinpoints of microwave radiation that are either slightly above or below that level, 2.7. So they look to see, is there a pattern? First of all, the Big Bang enthusiast said, oh, this is the proof of the Big Bang. This is the explosion of nothing that happened at the beginning of time, and it's been cooling off. So it is now 2.7 degrees. It was once much hotter. It was like the sun. So they said, they were very enthusiastic. They said, this is proof of the Big Bang. And they said, if you were in any other place in the universe, you would see the same sky. You would see the same pattern, because it's spread out from the beginning, from the same center. And so when you look at that initial radiation, they call it the remnant radiation from the Big Bang, you would see the same pattern no matter where you were. So suppose you were in Andromeda, Alec, on a star system, okay, on a planet in the star system. You looked up at the sky, you would see the same pattern that we see, okay, because of the Big Bang assumption. Well, what did they find? And why did they term it the axis of evil? Well, it turned out that there was a dipole. That means there's a left to right radiation pattern in a straight line. Okay. One of it is pointed towards the constellation Leo, and the other is in the opposite direction, the other end of the dipole. Now, this dipole is interpreted as the motion of the Earth with regard to the true center of the universe, the cosmic microwave background origin. Okay. So that's the way they say, oh, this dipole is our so-called Doppler shift. Okay. When something radiates while it's in motion, it produces a frequency shift, a Doppler shift. This is the principle of the cop's radar. Okay. They can tell how fast you're moving by, bouncing radar off the car, and the shift in the frequency tells how fast you're going. All right. This is at a cosmological scale, though. And this is the basis for the axis of evil, because the dipole not only is supposedly showing our motion through space, it is also pointing in a direction which corresponds with the equinox. Okay? The equinox is the 2 points where the sun's elliptic motion around the Earth crosses the equator. Okay? It's in the March and in September. That corresponds then to a characteristic of the Earth. More things that they've discovered about the dipole and the quadrupole and the octopole, which are higher level poles, that they align with the ecliptic, that is the sun's orbit, as well as with the equinoxes. So if you're this guy in Andromeda looking at the sky, you see the same pattern that we see on Earth. But why should he see the pattern on Earth that we see? Because only our sky has a sun with an elliptic orbit, and only our system, okay, has the equator where the Earth's equator is. All right? Have you heard this mentioned? No. All they tell you is it's an axis of evil. It's evil because it's contrary to what they are promoting as a Copernican principle. In fact, they have a cosmological principle, right? Which says everywhere in the universe is the same. Okay. Copernican principle just says the Earth is no different than everything else. Cosmological principle says we're in no special place. Everything else, everywhere else is the same. Of course, you can't prove this because you'd have to be outside the universe to look at it, to see it. If you're outside the universe, then you don't exist, right? There's such a web of illogic. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Anyway, you brought up the axis of evil. That's why they call it evil. Because it's evil to their way of thinking.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense.
Because the devil has anything to do with it. No.
It's evil because it might indicate that they have to believe in a creator in some way, and that the Earth is special. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So another thing that was mentioned in the PDF that you sent me was Airy's failure, and I know that also relates to falsifying the heliocentric model. Can we discuss that a little bit, and I'll pull up the chart? Okay.
Airy's failure is a key experiment. You see the date, 1871. So they were in the controversy of, is the world heliocentric or geocentric? And it was the beginning of the Aether theory, which was prevalent because of Maxwell's research in electromagnetism and the proof that a light wave is really an electromagnetic wave having a particular wavelength and frequency. Okay, so why is this important? Well, in this historical setting, Airy's response, is the world geocentric or heliocentric? And it also answered the question, is there an ether or not? This is one of the key experiments in my library of dissidence response to mainstream. Okay, George Airy was a royal astronomer at this time, so he was no slouch. He was in charge of the observatories in England, and he did an experiment, which I'm going to try to summarize, starting with the upper left. We have a stationary telescope aimed at some star, and we considered that what we observe is that we can never see the starlight directly, but we have to tilt the telescope at about 5 degrees. This is true for all stars. Let's say the tilt is 5 degrees. It's a small number. It doesn't matter what it is. It matters that you have to tilt it in order to get the star focused at the bottom of the telescope. So one of the theories would be, supposing that there is no ether. So you see at the top there, I have ether V equals 0. No ether. Well, if the telescope was on Earth, it would be moving with the Earth, and that would explain why you have to tilt the telescope, because the light beam, when it comes in, if it's tilted, would have to be tilted to match the speed of the Earth. The next diagram to the right shows, what if I had ether moving to the right? Then the ether would push the light beam to the left, and the light beam would enter the telescope tilted as it is shown in the diagram. And that would be possible with a stationary telescope. So what those two diagrams show is, well, the light beam could be tilted because the Earth is moving, or the Earth could be stationary, and the ether could be pushing the starlight and bending it 5 degrees. Okay, so the question is, which one is it? Go to the lower left. We add water. This is very clever of this guy. He adds water to slow down the light beam as it goes from the top of the telescope to the bottom. If it slows down, then if the Earth is moving, then it's going to be moving too slow to hit the bottom of the telescope. As the diagram shows, it will hit the side of the telescope. So with the 5 degrees tilt, which we know will make the starlight hit the bottom, if we add water, then that should make the beam hit the side of the telescope if the Earth is moving. All right, so this is a good test. Is the Earth moving or not? All right, if we can't see it after we add the water, then that means that the Earth is moving. And the next diagram shows if we tilt the telescope, let's say 10 degrees instead of 5, then we should have a moving telescope and ether still equals 0. But what actually happens is, as shown on the right, the telescope must be stationary, because if I add water, it hits the bottom of the telescope, which is the fifth diagram. If it hits the bottom of in the fifth diagram, then it shows that the water is unaffected the light beam is unaffected by the water, and it strikes the center of the telescope. So adding water in the short does not change this, but it would if the telescope were moving. So the conclusion is the telescope is not moving, and which means the Earth is not moving. The last diagram shows that if you have the ether coming in at an angle of 5 degrees and a stationary telescope in the water, then the only way you can explain why the light doesn't come directly from the star, which is the blue arrow, is that the ether is pushing it sideways. In this clever experiment, Airy has shown two things. Number one, that the Earth doesn't move, and number two, that there is an ether that is affecting the starlight as it comes to Earth. And this is called aberration. This is the aberration that we're talking about. Those yellow lines represent light coming into telescopes at different places on Earth. As you see at the pole, North Pole, you have to change the direction of your telescope over the path of a circle during a year. So this represents an entire year of observing the stars. And this is true for all stars. All right. So it's something that is happening to all of the light that comes to us into the solar system. It's all being bent by ether, an ether wind, which is perpendicular to the flight of the light. At the mid-latitudes, you see that the pattern is an ellipse. As you get further down to the equator, you see that it degenerates to a line. So you move the telescope back and forth in a line, not a circle, if you're at the equator. All of these can be explained by Airy's experiment. Number one, the water doesn't change the path of the light, which means that it's coming into the telescope already bent. And if that's true, then the Earth is not moving and the ether is causing the bending of the light. Two birds killed with one stone. Geocentrism is proven and the existence of ether is proven. But what did mainstream do with this? They ridiculed it and called it what? Airy's failure. It was not. It was Airy's success. He successfully proved geocentrism and the existence of ether.
That's a pretty big deal. That's a pretty big deal.
And you know why it's a big deal? Because you can tell they ignore it.
Right.
They ridicule it. They call it, they say when you're in opposition to the mainstream science, the first thing they do is ignore you. Then they ridicule you. Then they challenge you at all points until finally, when a generation has passed and the objectives have all died, the younger generation says, oh yeah, this is obvious. That's the way a paradigm shifts, right? From one way of thinking to another. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to get rid of all of the ones who are frozen in their thinking. And you have to have a new generation that is open to new ideas.
Amen. I think this, my generation and the generations below me are definitely open to new ideas. So it's good.
By the way, I interact with a Discord channel, Aether Cosmology. That's the channel. And I have very interesting discussions with them. And we do different presentations. You had Austin Whitsitt on, and I was on his program, on his channel, discussing basically the same ideas for, I think it was about a year ago.
That's awesome. I really like Austin. If you listen to this podcast, chances are you're focusing on your health and recovery a lot more than the normal human being. And that's a good thing. You might be exploring things like circadian biology, red light therapy, saunas, cold plunges, and some other things like this. But there's one thing that a lot of people overlook: the non-native EMFs in our environment. Things like Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and our cell phone signals. And it's easy to overlook this thing because we don't see it, but our bodies definitely feel it. There's no substitute for getting in nature. That's going to be the best way to regulate and come back to homeostasis. But when you're spending time in modern environments, inside our houses, inside our schools, inside our office spaces, it just makes sense to harmonize that environment as best you possibly can. That's why I've got Airy's Tech set up both in my house and in my podcast studio. They help to harmonize and neutralize the chaotic non-native EMFs in our environment rather than fighting them. Airy's Tech doesn't block non-native EMFs, and that's an important point to make. If something were truly blocking non-native EMFs, you wouldn't even receive a signal. A lot of so-called blocking technology that's out there can actually make interference worse, and we talk a lot about that in episode 186 of the Way Forward podcast, featuring CEO of Airy's Tech, Josh Bruni. I was genuinely impressed with some of the studies that have been done on Airy's Tech, especially the ones that have been done on professional athletes, and you can learn all about those on their website, or just head to the show notes. We'll have it linked there. This is all about being aware of the harmful effects of non-native EMFs, but not being fearful. But more importantly, doing something, helping to create a more clear, clean, living and work environment. So if you'd like to try Airy's Tech out, go to airiestech.com or just head to the show notes and be sure to enter code TWF25 at checkout, and that'll give you 25% off your order. So when I look at that chart that we just had up, let me go back to it one more time. This is still a spherical Earth. And I know that this is probably a perfect segue into this. You are a geocentrist, I guess you could say, but it's different. It's a nuanced take on geocentrism from my understanding. So we have heliocentrism, which is the idea that the sun is at the center of the universe. The Earth is revolving around the sun. The Earth is a spinning ball, one of many planets. Then we have the geocentric model, which puts the Earth at the center, but there's an even, I guess you could say, nuanced or secondary take within that on geostatism or geostatism. I'm not entirely sure on how to pronounce that, but could you describe what that is and how it differs from, let's say, the traditional concept that is typically tied with geocentrism, that we live on a stationary plane?
Sure. Actually, this represents evolution in my thinking. What you can prove scientifically with the scientific method is that the Earth is on the axis of rotation of the universe. Okay, the Earth doesn't rotate. Okay, that can be proven. But in order to be the center of the universe, how can you show that the Earth is equally distant? The North Pole is the same distance to the edge of the universe as the South Pole. Okay, in other words, okay, it's on the axis of rotation, but scientifically speaking, how can you show that the North and South Pole distances are the same? And I claim you can't scientifically. You probably never will be able. But what I've changed in my thinking is that going theologically rather than scientifically, the Earth is said to be at rest and created at the very first beginning. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Okay, not the rest of the universe, not the solar system. That comes later. Okay, the stars, everything, that came later. So what was there first? The Earth. So for theological reasons, Alec, I changed from geostatism, which is just that the Earth is at rest, not at the center. I changed to geocentrism by adding theology to my thinking. So yeah, you don't have to say geostatism anymore. I still say scientifically you can't prove that it's the center of the universe unless you know where the edge of the universe is. And what do we know from the Webb telescope? That it keeps going. It keeps going as they go deeper and deeper into space with more and more sensitivity. They find more and more objects, more and more galaxies and star systems. And so we don't know where the edge is. Probably never will. And our method of measuring distance, by the way, the redshift, is totally ad hoc. That is totally a principle without proof. Redshift can be formed by different ways, including by having the source of the light emit ether. So suppose a star, instead of just emitting light, emitted ether along with it. Well, then you would have to add or subtract the speed of the ether from the light beam, and that would cause a redshift. And that could be interpreted as though the star were moving, but it isn't. It's emitting ether, which simulates motion. So the Hubble shift is what I'm talking about. And the proof of the Big Bang, that everything is expanding, all of that also is based on very questionable science.
Right. Well, this brings up another point regarding the shape of the Earth. And this is a question I have for you. Has any experiment, has any researcher, has any scientist been able to validate that the Earth is a sphere without affirming the consequent or circular reasoning? Meaning that, is there any direct evidence that we have that the Earth is actually a sphere? Obviously, we've already discussed during this that there's multiple ways to falsify the idea, the preconceived idea that the Earth is moving, and all indications point to the Earth being at rest. So with respect to the shape of the Earth, though, is there any direct evidence that the Earth is actually a sphere, in your understanding?
Well, we already know it can't be exactly a sphere because we have all of the surface irregularities. If the Earth were like some other planets, Earth is not a planet, it's a static. If it were pure water, okay, then we could talk about whether it's a sphere, whether it has a bulge at the equator, right? Or whether it's flat, which is what most of my colleagues on Discord believe, the flat Earth. Well, I've learned that in order to prove that the Earth is of any particular shape, if you took samples at certain spots on Earth, you would get only the curvature at that particular point. What you would have to do is detect many experiments that detect the curvature at different places on Earth. And statistically, you would have to say, well, this is enough to prove that the Earth is either flat or curved or it's either a globe or a bulging at the equator, an ellipsoid, they call it. So there's no proof of that. No one has done experiments like that. Another way of proving it would be get out in deep space and look at the Earth from different angles and see if it always projects as a circle. That would mean that it must be a globe. Now, that used to be good for me, except now I don't trust NASA. I don't trust the pictures that they're sending. Now, it isn't because it's deliberate. I've learned that the pictures that they take are with a lens that has spherical aberration. Okay. That means that it doesn't give a true picture of the size and shape of objects. Okay. They do that in order that they can get the whole Earth in the picture, because you have to be very high. You have to be at where the weather satellites are in order to see the whole Earth. All right. So they don't use a clear lens. Okay. The other thing I learned is that they use mosaics. They patch together the pictures. All right. At lower altitudes. Okay. Which then says I have to trust that they made the seams of the pictures in the right places. Okay. We won't even get into the moon, right? Whether the moon landings, that's a whole different ball of wax. That's more politics than science. But the arguments that they give for the flat Earth, now I have to consider, acceptable in terms of what did they prove? What do they prove if they don't do a lot of experiments? Okay. What I would require is experiments over water, because then there wouldn't be any of the surface problem. Yeah, it would only be gravity. Gravity would be the only thing causing the curvature, if there is curvature, right? If it's flat, then you should be able to find that wherever you test in Earth. So that's where I am I believe the Earth is a globe. As far as theology, Robertson Jenner says that the Hebrew translation of the word for the world is actually round. Now, round can mean a round disk, 2 dimensions, or it can mean round in 3 dimensions, which would be a globe. So actually, theology, according to my colleague, I don't know Hebrew, but he's a Hebrew scholar. He says that the Bible doesn't really say whether it's a flat round disk or a 3-dimensional.
Spherical round, right. Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting for me. The one thing that stands out that I just can't get over is that the Earth's supposed radius value is roughly 3.8, 3.9 miles, right? And there are multiple examples taking into account differences in terrain and observer height versus object height relative to that radius value, and people being able to see much farther than they should be able to see, being able to see objects that are much farther, given the supposed mainstream accepted radius value of the Earth. That's the one of the biggest things that seems in my mind to at least falsify the mainstream's idea of the size and shape of the Earth, which would indicate that either we're on a ball that is much larger, or it is indeed not three-dimensional round and spherical.
Okay. The guys at the Discord channel, the ones who are the flat earthers, the flurfs, they would argue that the refraction of the light beam is what causes you to see over the horizon. And I did investigations on this. They submitted what they call the Battle of the Beams, which is a discussion of how the Germans bombed England by transmitting radar beams across a distance which should have been greater than over the horizon, but they could contact these planes even though they were beyond the visual horizon. And this is well documented, and it's a military application. But the science is the following. You can bounce signals off the ionosphere. We know that. So that's a way of going beyond the horizon. But if you talk about looking directly along the Earth's surface, just above the horizon, and ask, why can I still see over the horizon? I can see the mast of ships, right? I can see cities across Lake Michigan that should not be able to be seen. And refraction, which is the bending of light to the amount of moisture in the air, the humidity, that can explain it. They also have learned that the electric field of the Earth can affect the path of the light beam. But one of the biggest proofs for me is submarines. How do submarines communicate underwater? They use sonar, okay, sound waves, not electromagnetic waves, sound waves. But Russia can communicate with their submarine fleet all around the world underwater. That means that beam has to bend if the Earth is truly a sphere, has to bend according to the circumference of the Earth. It travels for huge distances, thousands of miles. So they can give commands to their submarines underwater with sound waves by refraction, by bending of the light. To me, that's an obvious proof. Just that they can communicate is a proof that there's fantastic amount of bending you can do with waves, whether they're light or sound.
But doesn't that presuppose that the Earth is indeed round? Because I feel like that's bringing in refraction and the bending of waves as a rescue device without first demonstrating in each of those examples that the waves are indeed bending. And I don't want to get hung up on this too much because I do want to talk about Aether. And ultimately, according to your research, it's cool that whether it's round and spherical or round in sort of disc shape or something else, we're on an infinite plane. I know some people say that we're not even sure what it is. It's some sort of infinite plane, some sort of hologram. There's so many different ideas. And I know that Aether fits into that. And ultimately, where we're talking about how there's multiple ways to falsify that the idea that the Earth is moving. But to me, it seems to sort of use the idea of refraction as a rescue device in order to explain away, presupposing that the Earth is a sphere and then that it has a 3,900, I misspoke earlier, 3,900 roughly mile radius value and being able to see well beyond that. And then when that would indicate, okay, it's not this size and shape. Let's bring in as a rescue device, because we presuppose that the Earth is this size and shape, refraction to explain this phenomenon.
Okay. My first reaction would be, we're talking about vertical refraction, right? Up and down refraction. But you can also do left and right refraction using lenses. You can use water. You can use any medium. Okay. And you can see, well, can I prove that refraction occurs not because of gravity, but because of the properties of the medium that the light is moving through? Okay. Which is the definition of refraction. The change of light direction due to a change in the material that it's moving through. So if you do a horizontal refraction experiment, okay, which has nothing to do with the shape of the Earth, okay, you can show that the bending does occur, that the light does bend, okay, the way it is claimed to, with the same medium, with the same humidity in the air. Yeah, over the water, it's a bigger effect because there's more humidity over the oceans. So in other words, to handle your objection, I could consider a horizontal where up and down don't affect refraction, but just the medium is proven to to change. And the same results. I mean, you'll find that in a certain medium, it bends a certain amount. And with certain humidity, it'll bend a certain angle. And you can then say, okay, if I do it vertically, what will happen? Same thing. Gravity has really no effect on a light, as we know, or that we've ever measured. Right?
So if you had to, let's say, describe your current cosmological view, would you say that you are of the mindset that the Earth is stationary at rest, but you believe, although you would acknowledge there is not direct evidence, but you'd believe all indications point to it still being a sphere?
Yeah, I haven't seen it disproof. I haven't seen it disproof. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, this is another interesting epistemological question too, though, regarding where the burden of proof lies, right? Because isn't it that the burden of proof lies on the individual making the claim? I believe that that's a maxim of law from my understanding.
Well, the scientific rule for evidence, the epistemology for science, is the scientific method. That you do experiments to see if there is some pattern, which you say, okay, I have a theory that will predict what these measurements are. So you have a theory, a hypothesis, you test it, and then you agree with experimental error whether this agrees with your theory or not. All right? What's missing from that is, in order to test your theory, you have to design an experiment, an experimental design. Okay? Like Michelson Morley, right? Like Sagnac. Okay? To test their theories about ether or whether the Earth is at rest or not, they had to come up with a physical experiment. How do you determine that? Now we come back to philosophy, which is above science. Because scientists think everything is below science. Okay? You know what scientism is?
Yes, I do.
Those are those who think science
very familiar.
is everything. Yes, science knows everything, can do everything, etc. Actually, it's technology, not science, that provides all the benefits. Science has made very few improvements in knowledge. GPS was engineered, which means they fiddled with it until it worked. They didn't use special relativity, Alec. No way. All right? Because if they use speed of light as constant, they would be miles away from the locations of the receiver. All right?
Well, like epistemologically, the burden of proof lying on the individual who's making the claim, and you're talking about like essentially the philosophy of science and epistemology of science.
Yeah, basically there isn't any. Okay? Because
this is a big issue I have. I agree with you. And so this is why, for me, I've come to understand the only true science, and it's not to say anything outside of this category isn't useful. I just want to preface what I'm about to say with anything outside this category. It's not to say it's not useful. I just don't know that we can call it science. For me, science means you have an observed natural phenomenon, right? And something that you observe happening in nature that you try to figure out the cause of, right? So you have an effect happening and you're trying to determine what is the cause of this effect that you see occurring in nature. Because if we go off track from that, we end up trying to reify preconceived ideas of what might be. And then we end up where we're tinkering with things, as you're saying, and then claiming that as science when really it's engineering or it's mathematics, which again are useful. That's fine, but it's not science in my mind.
Yeah, they have no basis, no epistemology for the claims that they make. I pointed out experimental design is one, right? How do you know that this experiment is going to test your theory? Okay. And what are the limits? Is it going to be good on the moon? I mean, is it true throughout the universe? Is it only, what conditions is it true under? All right. All of that is basically a philosophy. Okay. What is it being used for? The other thing that's missing from the scientific method is the interpretation of the results, like we've seen with the MMX and the Sagnac. Okay. And Airy's failure. and a bunch of others I could have shown you. All of those show that it's a guessing game. They don't have anything that they can say, and this is the axiom that I'm using. When I debate with someone, and that's very rarely, let's say I have a discussion with someone, a serious discussion. So the first thing I want to do is make sure we have common ground. The way you do that, to my mind, first of all, you and I have already agreed to use English to communicate. Okay? That's a key problem, because if we don't use the same language, it's going to be difficult, right? So we agree tacitly. We didn't say that, but we obviously agree on it. The next thing we have to agree on is philosophy. Of course, scientists say philosophy. I don't need no stinking philosophy. Okay? I don't, because what they're thinking of is the modern guys like Nietzsche and all the other ones who committed suicide, who are drugs, or wound up in insane asylums, all of the so-called modern philosophers. That's what they're thinking of. I'm thinking of Aristotle, Plato. I'm thinking of the great minds in history. And why we don't have them today, I don't know. If they ever showed up, they would be totally disappointed.
Hey, that's you. That's a few of my other friends, Dr. Tom Cowan, Dr. Andy Kaufman, Dr. Jordan Grant, and a few others. You're the modern Plato.
So what do I replace there? What is really nihilism? Okay. Nihilism is not believing in nothing. Okay. Or agnosticism, believing that there is truth, but you can't know it. Okay. So there is truth out there objectively, but humans can know it. If you have those two philosophies, I can't argue with you, right? There's no logical basis. It's like you're speaking Swahili, right? And I'm trying to interpret what you mean. And that's why I say I have very few debates, because what I require is realism. Realism is basically Aristotle's peripatetic school, okay, of hylomorphism, which means change occurs when matter is informed and creates a new being, a new substance. And that's called realism. It was updated by the scholastics in the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas would be one of the names. So that's what I believe. Okay. Those fundamental axioms.
So again, hylomorphism is the idea that everything is a union of matter and form.
Right.
Right. Okay. What is meant by form in that statement?
In form, matter is the potential, okay, to have different qualities. For example, if you had water and you ask, could I change it to ice? Okay. When there's a certain triggering event, namely the temperature, volume, and pressure, right? When you reach that chemical or physical condition, then it is possible for water to become ice. So we have the matter, which has the potential to change, and then we have what is actually changed. Okay? The form, like if you have a statue of marble and the sculptor says, I have an idea of what that should look like. It exists in my mind, right? I want to make it physical. So he basically eliminates everything that is not what he wants. All right. That's what you chisel. You don't put the form in. You eliminate everything that isn't the form. Okay. So that's a material change. But getting back to the water, changing water to ice means that water must have the potential, the potency to change. And then if it actually changes, it no longer has that potential. It can't change to ice if it already is ice, but it has different potential. What it can do now, it can change back to water. All right. So change is an interaction of matter and form, right? And the form that you have right now is your actual existence now, the attributes you have right now, but you can change because you have potential. You have matter, which is unformed, meaning it has no actuality. It still has potential. So everything we see, even spiritual things can be explained by hylomorphism, matter and form interacting.
Could a substitute for form there be thought?
Well, thought is the expression. It's something that you actually have, okay? You actually have a thought, but you haven't expressed it in the material world. So you have the world is the potential.
Yeah, the world is the world is matter, you would say. The world is matter, and then what does the form or thought precede matter?
Well, you mean in terms of creation?
Yeah, in terms of creation.
You mean when they were formed?
If you frequently tune into The Way Forward, you know that I strongly believe chronic and recurring stress is one of the leading causes of illness. And unfortunately, stress has become a commonplace experience for many of us in the modern world. Did you know that magnesium plays a crucial role in managing stress? It's essential for ensuring adequate hydration of your body's waters, regulating stress hormones like cortisol, balancing our nervous and hormonal systems, and producing the relaxing neurotransmitter GABA. Unfortunately, most magnesium supplements you'll find in health stores use only the two cheapest synthetic forms of magnesium. And since they're not full spectrum, they won't help with your magnesium deficiency or do much to support your health. There are actually 7 key forms of magnesium, and you must get all of them if you want to experience its calming, stress balancing effects. That's why I only recommend Magnesium Breakthrough by Bioptimizers. It's the only organic full-spectrum magnesium supplement that includes 7 unique forms of magnesium for stress resilience, better sleep, and better hydration, all in one bottle. For those interested, you can try Magnesium Breakthrough with an exclusive offer. Just go to bioptimizers.com/Alec or head to the show notes and use promo code ALEC10 during checkout to save 10% on your order. Because like if I look at my own direct experience, right? This device that we're communicating on right now, in this environment that I'm in right now, all indications point towards, based on my own direct experience, this being how do I put this? An example of how reality works. What I mean by that is, these were all thought about first. A human being had the thought for this computer, this microphone, this camera, all of the things in this environment, and that preceded matter taking shape.
Right.
Which, again, you would have to extrapolate, but it looks like that might be the same when it comes to the nature of this experience, that thought comes first. Thought precedes the material form.
Yeah, if we ask, instead of all these manufactured things that surround us, suppose we ask, what about ourselves? How did we come into being? Okay? And then you have to, using the same reasoning, say, there must have been a thought that preceded our creation. Okay? And you know where that's going.
Right. Not the Big Bang.
That's why I said.
Not the Big Bang. That's where it's going.
No. I was thinking higher than that.
I know.
That's why I say all paths lead to Rome. Actually, all paths lead above.
Lead to above, lead to the creator. Exactly. Yeah. So I don't know if this would be a good time to talk about Aether and the alpha model, because I want to touch on Aether, especially knowing that you are both deeply rooted in quote unquote science, but also you could say some esoteric concepts and also just theology in general. I would like to hit on Aether from both a scientific lens, but also a metaphysical esoteric lens, if we could, from your understanding. So what is Aether, and then what is the alpha model?
Aether goes back a long time. The word itself is Greek, meaning a space, or how did Aristotle put it? The fifth element.
Air, earth, wind, fire, ether.
Exactly.
So, sorry, air, earth, water, fire, ether.
Right. It's called the quintessence, the fifth essence. Okay. So that they knew that space isn't empty. Okay. That if there's light coming to us, that there must be something that it's coming through to get to us. And it was the basic building block of the universe. In other words, everything was made from ether. And there's been a lot of refinements, a lot of different interpretations. What is ether? What does it do? Are there different types of ether? Is there one that is free in space? And then there's another one which is bound to a local area. In other words, a particle. So all of the particles, are they just spinning pieces of ether? Whereas if I look out in space, am I looking through the free version of ether, meaning free, meaning not tied to anything. All right, so that concept has been refined through the ages until scientifically Maxwell proposed equations, electromagnetic equations, in which two parameters of his theory, the epsilon, the permittivity, the electric permittivity of space, and mu, the magnetic permittivity, permeability of space. Those two constants determine the speed of light. So it was a great discovery by Hertz when he did the experiment to show that the speed of light indeed is the combination of the two electric and magnetic constants of space. And the problem then was, what is it moving through? If the waves are waving, what are they waving? Okay. Reasonable question. We know that water and sound and everything, they have mediums. The ether was called the luminiferous ether, luminiferous, meaning light-bearing in Latin, because they said that this is what explains how starlight can get to Earth, because there is an ether in between. In fact, it's everywhere by definition, right? There is no place where it is not.
All-consuming.
All-consuming, yes. Yes, in other words, everything is made of ether, okay, in different forms.
You could say that air, earth, fire, and water are different formations of ether.
Right. Whereas there's a group that says those are 5 distinct objects. There is the modern view, which is ether is the primary composition of everything. Energy, fire, water, air, and earth, or dirt, or solids in general. Yeah. Okay, so they wanted to test the luminiferous ether to see if it is the speed of light, and we did the MMX. We found that there was a slight fringe shift, which they interpreted as meaning, okay, there is no ether. But then they had the problem, the Earth is therefore at rest. Okay, if it's not moving through the ether, it's at rest. So we went through that. The modern, well, you asked, what is my theory for the ether, right? Yeah, okay. Well, I got a phone call from Bobson Jenis. He was in Germany, and he just came back, and he was very enthusiastic. He said, I talked to this man named Helmut Posch, who wrote a book about a visionary in the, 11th century, who had theories of the universe, which include ether, and he wanted me to examine whether those theories were true. You could call it the Bingen theory, because Bingen is the town in which the visionary lived. That they also called Hildegard's vision, because Saint Hildegard was the one who received the visions. Okay, so we have this theological involvement. But Hildegard wrote several books, at least 5. She was a polymath. She had ideas about health. Okay, which you would have an ideal candidate for interview. She had all kinds of health recommendations, but they were based on what you would probably consider astrology today.
I would love that. I've interviewed a few people who are along those lines. That's amazing.
Yeah, and positions of the moon, and but that's not of my interest. She wrote a lot of hymns. In fact, some of them are still sung in Europe. But the science component, okay, she had a section on science, which Helmut Posch translated to German from the Latin, and it consisted of her thoughts or visions. They weren't her thoughts. They were visions that, like John the evangelist was given in the book of Revelation, write down what you see. She was told exactly the same thing, okay? And she wrote these down, and the book is called The Constitution of the Universe, the true constitution of the universe. In German, das wahre Weltbild. Das wahre Weltbild. Anyway, this was a great revelation to me. I told Bob, okay, you've got this new theory of science, okay, new ideas. I'm going to read the book, and as soon as I find something that I know is false, I'm going to throw it away. Well, that was 15 years ago, and I haven't thrown it away, okay? There are very surprising things in there. There are very, what you might consider juvenile, might consider like dreams. But if I prove it, any of the statements theologically or scientifically, I should say, I find no problem. So I'm still looking. I still haven't thrown the book away.
What is the name of the book one more time? Because I want to read this now.
I can give you the reference.
Okay, yeah. I'll share it in the show notes once you look it up again.
Okay. All right. I can give you the link. And I think it's a $10 PDF.
Okay, great.
Or I can send you a copy. All right. So I absorbed the book, the scientific content, just the word about the theology. She does talk about Genesis. There are some surprising things there, that the firmament did not rotate when it was created. It started to rotate at the fall. So once the apple was eaten, then the universe, the firmament, began to rotate. Also, she identifies the firmament with what we would call the ether. What is it on day 3? The waters were separated. The waters above and below were filled with firmament. Okay, the word itself tells you that it is solid. It is solid, but transparent, okay, and has amazing properties, very low density, but transparent, and yet has the rigidity of steel, so that the stars can rotate in this firmament because it is rigid. In fact, the Hebrew word rakwa means steel coating, or like a what do you call it? The thin plates of steel that are used in construction or for the roof, right? So this is the theological part. If you go to the last slide, I can show you a summary of what the book shows. In the lower left, you see Hildegard recording the visions. And this is something she drew herself. The vision of the world shows that man is the primary focus of the creation. Okay? It dominates the picture. The world is shown as a circle. Of course, you can't show the 3 dimensions in a 2-dimensional diagram. So this doesn't prove either that it's flat or that it's a globe, but it does show that there are boundaries for the universe, and that there is an energy or fire. You see the red beyond the outer chain, that it goes around the circumference. That represents energy. My interpretation of that is the fire that is described by, I think it is Daniel. In Daniel 7:10, it says that he comes upon a throne, and the throne is covered with fire, and the fire leads trails off, and streams away from the throne. I'm paraphrasing. I should know the words exactly. And the question I have is, okay, this seems to be the throne of the Father. The fire seems to be what powers the earth, what powers the universe. So the flow that you see coming from the throne, I identify with the fire that you see in this diagram surrounding the globe, surrounding the circle. So that's my interpretation of Daniel 7:10.
I found the verse, if you want me to read it real quick.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So it's Daniel 7:9-10. As I was watching, thrones were raised up. The Ancient One took his seat. His clothes were white like snow. His hair was like a lamb's wool. His throne was made of flame. Its wheels were blazing fire. A river of fire flowed out from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood ready to serve him.
Thank you. You noted two things that I should have noted. Number one, there were wheels of fire. Now, one of the basic ideas of ether theory is that it forms a vortex. It forms like a tornado, an invisible tornado, but nevertheless one. And one of those ether vortexes surrounds the Earth, which explains the Foucault pendulum. It's being affected by the flow of the ether. It's not the rotation of the Earth. It's the flow of ether at the equator, which is the greatest, that causes the Foucault pendulum to rotate. And it's a river of fire. So it's constantly flowing, but Daniel doesn't tell us where it goes. My interpretation is that it's going, as this diagram shows, from the periphery of the universe, from the edge of the universe, into our physical universe. Around the outside, you see animal heads. These are symbolic of the winds. In other words, each animal has a certain type of wind. For example, there is a lamb. So my interpretation would be, oh, that's a gentle wind. Then there are bears and lions. That represents a strong wind. And these are positioned in such a way that they are about 23 degrees away from the center. Okay, you see them at the top and the bottom, Alec? The animal heads in the blue area?
Yep, I see them there in the blue area, but then also in the red area as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm not getting into the details because it takes the whole book.
Got it. I want to read this book. This looks incredible already.
Now, if they are spread apart by 23 degrees, do you know what the 23 degrees corresponds to? That's the tilt of the ecliptic to the equator. In other words, the sun goes up and down 23 degrees north and south of the equator in a year, right? The cycle of the sun, which gives us the seasons. So these winds are positioned so that they can blow the ecliptic. The ecliptic is the orbit of the sun and all the planets around the Earth. Okay. The stars rotate around the polar axis. So they have a different orientation, a different speed. So my interpretation, as I said, is those three animal heads represent the winds that actually move the sun and the planets, the whole solar system. In other words, tilts up and down in a year, something like a plate that's rolling.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, like a never-ending wobbling plate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Over our heads.
That's the image I use. Then you have spheres inside. Oh, by the way, these areas, these zones contain either air, water, fire, or earth. Well, Earth is at the center. So the three circles, the three different elements of the universe are shown in the diagram. And of course, there's a bigger one in the book. And then inside where the white area is, that represents space, empty space between the planets. And then we have the solar system, and everything else is in that brown area. And the Earth is at the center. And of course, the book describes all of this in more detail. And it has, more chapters and areas and topics that I could discuss, which indicate that the winds that she's talking about are ether winds. And that's basically the model that I'm building on, that the Earth is being, or the universe is being controlled by these external winds. In a spiritual interpretation, I would say the animals and everything are symbolic of angels who are trusted or charted with producing the effects that are according to God's plan.
Wow, that's beautiful.
There's about 100 pages in the book that relate to science. And so, yeah, I recommend it to you and your audience.
I'll definitely put it in the show notes so people can check it out. You know, it's interesting to me because I feel like that would indicate that nature itself, unadulterated, is just a perfect representation of God on earth.
Yeah, you can you can draw analogies whenever you have the number 3 to the Trinity. This represents, I think, the unity of God with man. I mean, man is the center. I mean, in science, no one would say that man is the center of our focus. But that's exactly what the diagram shows, that the universe was created for man. Okay? Not that man was created as part of the universe. And that's what the whole theme of the book is. And how everything is controlled. The book also discusses how gravity is produced by the winds, because the flowing of the air through the atoms is transparent. Most of the atom is empty space. We know that. But the nucleus is not penetrated by the winds. So there's a slight drop in the pressure due to the winds when it enters an atom. If you add up all of the atoms on Earth, you have gravity, because each little atomic source of gravity, although it is powers of 10 small, becomes large enough to become visible as gravity when all of the atoms on Earth are accounted for.
Would you say that electromagnetism has any role in that, and any role as what we refer to as gravity, which is objects falling to the Earth, essentially?
I don't know, but the model that I use is called the Aether vector potential for electromagnetism. You probably know that modern theory uses electric and magnetic fields to describe Maxwell's equations, okay? They consist of E and B's. Electric and magnetic fields. Well, it turns out that you can use a single field called the Aether vector potential.
So this Aether vector potential field, is that the right way to say it? Aether vector potential field?
Correct.
So that incorporates electromagnetism, encompasses it.
Yes. The A field, as it's called, is the curl of A is B, and the electric field is the gradient of a scalar potential plus the gradient of electric field. And as you said, it's a combination of the two, but notice vector potential has 4 components. The electric and magnetic field each have 3, which is 6. So you reduce the complexity from 6 to 4. In other words, there's extra baggage, extra things in Maxwell's laws that aren't needed, that the basic ether that underlies electromagnetism can be expressed as one vector, the A vector, okay? Which is a 4-dimensional vector, meaning in time as well as space. So that's what I'm basing my theory on to explain how ether relates to electromagnetism.
Got it. Okay. And I love how you said scalar there, because from my understanding, like, let's take, for example, the human biofield, right? That is the National Institute of Health. This is paraphrased, but they basically say that it is the field that is comprised of electromagnetism and other fields, or something to that effect. Basically, they're giving lip service to the idea that there is other unmeasured fields that exist outside of the electromagnetic spectrum. They don't say exactly what that is, but you just mentioned scalar waves and scalar fields. So this is where your idea incorporates both traditional electromagnetism and also scalar into one unified idea, essentially.
Yeah, there's one field, the ether field. There's no longer an electric and magnetic field.
Yeah, I love that.
They're derived from the ether field. Yeah.
So can we talk about the ALFA, the alpha model?
Yeah, that's just an acronym which I decided to use when people say, "Hey, Bob, what's your theory?" And instead of handing them a book, I got to give them some shorthand. So I called it ALFA. Okay, the ALF is the absolute lab frame. That means that in dynamics, if you want to use the law of physics and make a correct prediction, in other words, you want an inertial frame, then you must use the lab frame. That is the Earth's reference frame at rest. NASA calls it the ECEF, Earth-centered, Earth-fixed. All right? That's the frame of reference in which the laws of physics must be presented. Now, the FA part, the last part, that stands for fluid ether. As you saw in my Hildegard presentation and in my MMX and in Sagnac, in all of the presentations, except for gravity is static ether. The motion of ether is termed an ether wind or a fluid ether. In other words, there have been ether theories, Alec, that use a rigid ether. Okay? In fact, a lot of the MMX theories assume that the ether is rigid and the Earth is moving through it, right? But relativity says that if the ether were moving and the Earth were stationary, you would get the same result. You get the same measurements. So that's the resolution of that. So alpha becomes a combination of two concepts which are critical. The ALF, and if you ask, well, how do you support that with experiments? The answer is Newton's bucket. In fact, I have a challenge on the Discord channel. I have a PDF challenge to mainstream to try and prove that my Newton's bucket analysis is incorrect. Remember, I'm saying that not only is the bucket, does it give the wrong results? It doesn't predict correctly when it's done in the lab. It's done anywhere in space, in the universe. And the reason that it can be done anywhere is because it's the ether that's resisting the motion of the bucket. And the ether is everywhere. And if the resistance of the ether is causing this, then it's a universal law. Okay? And the theory of Newton and of Mach, Ernst Mach, which are the two popular mainstream theories, they're both incorrect. They're partially correct because, yes, it is the distance, the distant space, rather, that is also involved. And I guess Newton is correct in the sense that, well, absolute isn't any definite physical space, so it could be the Earth. So they don't eliminate the correct answer, but I state, I think, the correct answer, that the Earth is the only place where you can do the experiment. If you did, by the way, if you look in space, notice everything is moving. Everything is rotating around the Earth. So everything is like Newton's bucket, right? Everything must obey that centripetal force except for one object in space. You know what it is? The geostationary satellite. That's stationary over the Earth. It's in space, but it's stationary. So what do I predict? I predict that Newton's laws and all the laws of physics are valid on that satellite. That if you did experiments on that satellite, you could predict correctly what would happen. But if you used any other satellite, which is in motion around the Earth, it would not. All right, so there's a test. If they ever decided to do it, test the laws of physics on the geostationary satellite, the GSS.
How do you think satellites work?
Well, they obey Newton's laws if they're artificial satellites. The planets, if you're referring to them, and the moons and everything.
I call those the celestial bodies. So let's talk about artificial satellites first and then the celestial body.
There's a pattern of ether around the Earth, which basically corresponds to Newton's laws. And so when you launch an artificial satellite, it will obey the laws of Newton and not conflict with ether theories, because the ether circles, the vortices, are still there. They don't predict anything different. Not that I've discovered so far. So there's no conflict with artificial satellites. With the natural satellites, which were created, they have ether winds, which I talked about, right, with Hildegard and Bingen theory. Those winds determine the motion of everything in the universe except the Earth. The Earth is stationary. So you have the natural satellites and you have the artificial satellites. And then the natural satellites obey the vortices of the ether winds that were there from creation and presumably managed by the angels, right? That's my projection. Yeah.
That checks out for me too. I like that. Most healthcare today operates on an outdated mechanistic model, treating the body like a battlefield rather than a self-healing system. You wait months for an appointment only to receive a rush diagnosis that labels you rather than truly understanding your unique health. Even in holistic health, many practitioners rely on endless lab tests and supplement protocols, addressing symptoms instead of the root cause. And the result? Another prescription or supplement regimen that merely suppresses or masks symptoms rather than facilitating true healing, whether the imbalance was physical, emotional, energetic, or a mix of all three. And that's why Dr. Tom Cowan co-founded the New Biology Clinic, to offer something radically different. As one of the most respected natural health doctors in the world, Dr. Cowan has spent decades challenging conventional medicine and advancing a deeper understanding of human biology, water, and natural health. His work isn't just about rejecting the mainstream, it's about offering a more truthful, biologically coherent approach for healing. The New Biology Clinic recognizes that health isn't about fighting disease, it's about restoring balance. You're not a diagnosis, you're an individual with a unique story, and healing should honor that. With virtual consultations available worldwide, the clinic offers a flat-rate monthly membership that gives you direct access to practitioners who take the time to actually listen. Members also get exclusive health live streams, a resource library, and live sessions covering everything from biofield tuning and breathwork to movement and meditation, all designed to support whole body healing. And if you're not ready for a membership, you can book a one-time appointment, sign up for an enrichment-only membership for the healing modalities alone, or schedule a free connection session with one of the care team members to see how the New Biology Clinic can help in your specific situation. This isn't about keeping you dependent on doctors. It's about making you sovereign over your health. Head to newbiologyclinic.com and use code THEWAYFORWARD, and that's spelled The Way, F-O-R-W-A-R-D, for $50 off account activation, or just head to the show notes for more info. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com for $150 off. Your body already knows how to heal, and New Biology Clinic helps you remember. So I have some, questions that are more on the esoteric, theological side of things. So if God is indeed omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and are you familiar with the term the Akasha or the Akashic records? That it's an idea that there is you could call it a library, but it's not a physical place. It's a stamped into reality library of information that has the records of everything that it has occurred in reality. Some say that it's a literal place, if you could call it that, like a metaphysical place that you could go to. But some describe that it's just synonymous with the information field that contains the records of everything that has occurred in reality over the course of time.
So it's like a DNA for the universe?
I guess you could say that, sure. I guess you could say that.
DNA has our information, genetic information. Okay. The history of everything that all of our ancestors did is stamped in some way. But you're saying that this is a non-living, inanimate library.
Well, I don't know that it's non-living, right? And even, this is a separate conversation, but I wonder if DNA itself is more of a receiver for information rather than a physical codex of our ancestry. That's a separate conversation. I'll send you an episode I've done on that to highlight some issues with the genetics model, but that's neither here nor there. What I'm getting at is like, I don't know that Aether is synonymous with God. I'd say that that's a little bit absurd to make that claim. And again, this is my belief. I would say that Aether is the communicatory, if that's a word, bridge between us and God. Like we can access God through the Aether. I don't know. I'm trying to articulate this. Words fail to describe what I'm getting at, but I guess the question is, how does God relate to the Aether from your current frame of mind?
It's through philosophy, through holomorphism, that I understand the role of Aether. Aquinas talks about matter as being the potential to form certain things. As I said, water has the potential to be other forms, other phases. We have the potential to change physically, spiritually, and so on. Well, suppose there is something called prime matter, Alec. Prime matter is the first potency, the first which contains all possibilities because it must. For all future things to be possible, you must have the first possibility, okay? And that's called prime matter. And this is discussed in Aquinas, in the scholastic philosophy. So is this prime matter, is it physical? Well, it doesn't have to be. It can be something that is, by definition, potential to be something. So it must exist because you can't have something from nothing. That's one of Aristotle's principles. From nothing comes nothing. Of course, he said it in Greek, but from nothing comes nothing. So they understood that there is a possibility, this prime matter, that can exist potentially to produce everything that does exist. And it produces basically a never-ending chain of changes, okay, that start from prime matter, but then change along the way. So that we have, for example, we have atoms that can combine into molecules, okay? And then the molecules can combine into chains of molecules that become physical chemicals or human flesh or whatever. So all the building blocks, we think of atoms as building blocks, but suppose prime matter is the building block for everything, that it contains, by definition, the potency, the possibility of producing everything. Not directly, but by a chain of changes. Okay? So that's a philosophical viewpoint that you could read about in Aquinas. And that's something that I think matches the definition of ether. Something that has the potential to be anything and is everywhere. Okay? It acts everywhere. And I think we can make a philosophical connection between the connection between the definition of prime matter and what we see in science as, at the lowest level, ether. But I think there are different forms of ether. We never see the prime matter because that is never actualized. That is, it never changes. It's always potential, never actual. Okay, so what we see are the forms of ether, like when it's in motion or when it's at rest, static ether in gravity. We see different phases, just like with water, we see different phases. Ether has different types, and that's what my research is showing. In the Michelson Morley experiment, we see light that is being affected by ether that's coming from the stars. I don't know if we mentioned it in the Michelson Morley experiment. They have to turn the apparatus 90 degrees so that the light always travels the same distance, right? So they interchange the distances. The other thing they do is they try and point it towards the maximum fringe shift. Okay? So if you're pointing it perpendicular to the true ether wind, you'll get no fringe shift. If you point it at 90 degrees to that in the right direction, you'll get the maximum fringe shift. That is, you'll get the most you can. So if you point it in that direction of maximum ether, they find out that points in the direction of Leo, okay, the constellation Leo. That turns out to be, guess what? The same direction as the dipole in the CMB. The alleged direction of the Earth is supposedly moving towards this location in Leo, okay? They say that's the Doppler shift. I say no, the Earth is stationary. That location is coming towards us. Here's another interpretation, theological. Leo, in the signs of the zodiac, is the last sign. Virgo, is the first sign, right? That's the virgin birth. Okay, you go through all the signs of the zodiac, which represent the life of Christ, salvation history, and you come to Leo. Okay, the promise of Leo, the lion, is that the Lion of Judah, Christ, will return again. So here we have this point in Leo, the lion, which has been created, as we're told in the Psalms, as a indication in the sky of salvation history, that Leo, the Leo location, is coming at us at about 360 kilometers per second. Okay. Now, the end of the world is coming too. So is this Christ, who is the Lion of Judah, coming back? I don't know.
That just blew my mind. Whoa. Oh my gosh. I got to sit with that one for a while after this. Oh my gosh. Wow. Have you heard of the idea? This is a better articulation of what I was saying earlier, that the ether is synonymous with a conscious field, or the ether itself contains the field of consciousness, or is the field of consciousness?
Well, consciousness is our description of our internal thoughts.
But how do we know they're internal?
Well, yeah, we don't know that. Well, we have to separate the brain from the mind, right?
Yes.
Brain is the physical, the mind is the mental, the spiritual, okay? And does the spiritual have to be located in the brain? I don't know. It has to be connected with our body in some way. But when you talk about spiritual space, then it doesn't make much sense. There is no up and down, left and right, north and south in spiritual space. So we really don't know what our reference is when we talk about the consciousness. The way we can think is definitely not physical. Definitely not physical. But exactly what it is, I guess that's why books are full of theories about what is thinking, what is a thought.
I just think of, so you think of something like the phenomenon of you thinking about someone right before they call you. I'm sure you've had something like this happen. You think about someone, then they send you a message, or they call you right after you think about them. And what I found in my own direct experience is that the more I pay attention to things like this, the more they occur. You could call them synchronicities, whatever. I think it's that we're exercising a muscle, so to speak, in air quotes, that we weren't aware that we had. And my current idea of one of the functions of ether is that it is the substrate by which these non-electromagnetic waves that we have that are related to psychic phenomena, intuition, things like this, I guess you could say intuitive abilities, are carried, are transmitted. That ether is the substrate for that. That ether itself is fundamentally spiritual and is the carrier of the unmeasurable occurrences that happen, that we all acknowledge happen, that some chalk up as coincidence. Many of us would say are synchronistic at the least. That's where my mind goes when thinking about ether.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever thought along those lines.
Well, I've had coincidences where I've thought of somebody who I haven't had contact with for a while for some reason. And then I have an indirect contact. I read about them. I don't contact them, but I read about them, even though it's been a long time since I even thought about them. And also ideas, not just people, but ideas that I've put away for a while. And then they come, I'm trying to solve a problem in physics, and it'll come back. Maybe that's a way to solve the problem. Okay. But it came out of nowhere. It came, I wasn't doing anything that would provoke it. So we called them God incidences instead of coincidences, that perhaps God is the source of prompting us in a certain direction. But we have not enough knowledge to know what the purpose of all of this is. It's way above us.
Amen. I agree with that. I agree with that. Oh, man. This has been great, Robert. I really appreciate your time on this. Is there anything else you want to share related to Aether or your cosmological view or even your theological view related to the cosmological view or anything like that? You've left me with a lot to think about.
I think the book reference is going to be of interest to you and your audience because it's sort of an indication of something in the past that is now becoming visible to us. Remember, I said this was in the 12th century, 1100s, that this woman lived, this visionary, okay? And her book has been buried for a long time. We have the case of the Shroud of Turin, which was the burial shroud of Christ. That's my belief, even though there's scientific, quote, evidence that it's a hoax of the Middle Ages. Anyway, notice that was buried in secrecy by the Crusaders. They came back from Europe, and I think it's in Turin now, in a cathedral in Turin. And it's sort of a prompting to remember, that this is truth, that, people say, well, what happened 2,000 years ago is not, we have no proof of that. Well, the Shroud of Turin is one proof. You can't explain the image. No one can explain the image of how it was formed and the blood types and there's books and books on it. And you have skeptic scientists who did the studies and they converted, right? They converted because they went to disprove it and they wound up proving it was authentic. So yeah, these things like the book, the Hildegard book that are now popping up. And we have such a physical world today that is so mixed up. I mean, politically, there's so much dangers and threats. In New York, we have a communist mayor for the first time. We have all signs of a civil war potential. We have people who are starving because they're on the food stamp program, and all of this seems to be headed towards some kind of a climax, and it's not going to be nice. It's not going to be, I'm not predicting anything. I don't know what's going to happen, but I don't see that it's going to be anything good unless it leads to the final coming of Christ. So yeah, the book is what I would recommend. If anyone wants, I don't know, do you give out emails, locations? Or?
Yeah. I mean, if you'd like to, yeah.
You can put that in the notes. Put my email if anyone wants to contact me.
Thank you so much, Robert. This has been great. I really appreciate this.
This is great. I appreciated your interview with Austin and also with Dr. Pollack on the 4 states of war. That would have been a good one for Aether too, because
that would have been great.
Yeah. Okay, Alex. Good to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Good luck with moving forward.
Yes, right? The way forward.
Yes, the way forward.
I like that. That's good. Thank you, Robert.
All right. Take care.
You as well.
Goodbye.
Bye.